Hello and welcome to this quick guide on how to set up and play arcade games in your games in Crayta. So in this context, an arcade game would be a simple game that when you interact with it, it takes control of your player and you can't move around, you can't look around, but you can still interact with the game. And it usually will have a slightly different gameplay mechanic to a normal Crayta game where you're running around as your usual player character. So the way we do something like this is firstly start by making your game mechanic. So this simple hammer game, I started in the player template and I added a hammer to the player template, and then I added a script to control the hammer. It's quite a straightforward script, and you have to button bash and it pulls back the hammer, and then you press a button and it fires it forward. And so I used the on button press function there and the on tick to do those things. So once I had made that really basic gameplay mechanic, the next step is to create a game specific character. So this is a specific character for your arcade game. Notice in my templates here, I've got a player, which is the standard Crayta player template that you get bundled with every game when you start making a new game. And I've got this hammer player template. And if we take a look at the hammer player template, it's got all of the movement. It's invisible, and it's got all of the movement and looking around stuff removed. And that's so that we can get that fixed perspective and that fixed position for our arcade game. Once you have those two characters and you're spawning your player character as your default spawn in your world settings or in your gameplay, which should automatically spawn in your player character. Once you have that, the next thing is to add your arcade game entity into your game world. So here I've added a test your strength machine. Add a script to that so that when the user or when the player interacts with that arcade game entity, you essentially get hold of the user from the player by using get user. You despawn the current player, which will remove their character. The user will stay in the game, but their character will be removed. So their physical embodiment will be removed from the game and they'll just be left floating around like a ghost. And then you spawn in a new player with your specific player template for your arcade game, as well as the location that you want to spawn them. And I would suggest you use a locator to tell your game where to spawn that new player template. And then once you've got your new player spawning in, so if we have a look at that in action, if I walk up to this and I interact with it, you'll see that my user disappears. So it's actually just despawned my normal player character, and it's spawned in a specific player character for the arcade game. The game mechanic works within that player template. So the last step is really to set up the UI for that specific game. So in order to do that, if we look at the start game script again, notice that I'm using a center local show UI on the user. And that's because in order to show the user interface to the user, we need to do that on the local rather than on the server. So that show UI literally corresponds to a function in this script here, which just shows this UI widget. So I'll start with this widget invisible and then it shows it there. The reason that we have this widget already attached to our user is because there's only one user in the game, whereas there can be lots of consecutive player characters. So we need to have all of the user interface set up, and then we just toggle it on and off using these center local functions and the scripts within there. And so there you have it. That's essentially the crux of how to set up an arcade game in your game in Crayta. And with a few bells and whistles and a little bit of polish, you can really make it shine. Here's one that I've made earlier. So if I walk up to this and interact with it, and then I use a couple of buttons to pull this hammer back, press space to fire, and I get my score. That's my arcade game. I really look forward to seeing what arcade games you make and to have a little play around with them when I see you in Crayta.